I wanted to start, before we dive into talking about experiential learning, I wanted to talk about active learning and how we define active learning. And the reason I want to do that is because we often get active learning and experiential learning kind of muddled, which is quite easy to do. Very similar. And so differentiating them, I think, can be a helpful way to think about defining experiential learning. So we're going to begin with the premise that students gain knowledge or come to know through their learning experiences with us as part of their academic program. When we have students do something with that knowledge, apply it, students are doing an activity. So we have students active and engaged in a process. So students taking their knowledge and applying it is an activity. This is really helpful. We know we do this in our classrooms quite frequently. We get students to engage, we get them to think, and that is incredibly helpful. We make it an intentional learning experience when we add feedback and reflection. That's what turns it from students doing an activity to students being engaged in active learning. And that feedback and reflection is really crucial. And again, I see heads nodding. I know this group will be very aware of this. That feedback is where we let students know how their application of that knowledge, how they did in that. What they got right, what they could do differently, how they could adjust. And we can give them that feedback in a lot of different ways. It doesn't necessarily mean we're giving them written feedback. They could talk to a peer. We could show them what good looks like. They could discuss it. And we could give them a correct answer if it's something that's more of a formula problem. And then we give them that opportunity to take that feedback and think about what they would do the same or different next time in that application of knowledge, that reflective piece. And that's what gets us to active learning. So how is experiential learning different than this? In experiential learning, we add context, where the context is actually a really important component of the learning and the outcomes that we want students to achieve. So it's that essential component. The application occurs in that context. So just as with, and that's what experiential learning is. Just as with active learning, if we take away the reflection and feedback, we have students doing an experience. Again, can be valuable, but it's that feedback and reflection that really gets us to that experiential learning. So that really critical piece. Turns it from something that is just students doing an experience to students having that intentional learning opportunity. In this, we've got really 4 essential elements of experiential learning, and you'll see those defined on your one-page handout. That feedback and reflection, which I've talked about, and that doing or application in context. I wanted to just talk a little bit more specifically about that doing in context, because the way we define those is important, again, in helping us determine what is and isn't experiential learning. So to be experiential, there we go. To be experiential learning, for that doing in context, we want students to apply their knowledge by actually doing an activity. That we want that to be creating a situation where there are unpredictable factors, where students have to make decisions in that application and kind of navigate some level of complexity. And that application should happen in an authentic context, where students make decisions and they are actually trying to determine what the best path forward is as they go throughout the process of applying their knowledge. So that authentic context could be because they've got an authentic problem that they're dealing with. It could be that they have a real client that they're working with that gives it that authenticity. It could be that they have an audience beyond the class that they're sharing outcomes to. In some way, we are making that more complex, having students make decisions and navigate that unpredictability in the application in context. So let's just work through an example. There we go. So we often talk about labs in experiential learning. When is a lab experiential learning and when might it not be? So it's a question we often get asked. So I have chosen this example. So in a first-year lab, we have students learn the steps of a process to get to a correct result. We have students actually using lab equipment to actually gain those kind of technical skills that they need as they go. They might get feedback throughout the process if they have a question on something that didn't quite go right, or the lab instructor kind of comes by and gives them some guidance on what they're doing. And they might get a mark on a lab report at the end. This wouldn't be experiential learning, and that's mostly because of that unpredictability. They're following steps, they're not having to make decisions or limited decision making, and so it's more formulaic in terms of what the students are doing. Really important active learning. They are gaining really essential skills, but it's not flipping into that experiential learning form. We have an upper year lab where a student is actually designing a process for investigation and data analysis. They're actually narrowing and defining a problem. They're maybe developing an hypothesis. They're actually creating and using a process to get to test that hypothesis and then decide how to analyze the outcomes. The student probably through that will be getting ongoing feedback on their decision making and their process as they go, both in terms of how things actually go and an instructor helping them throughout the process. So the lab and that complex problem make this experiential learning. That decision making that the student needs to do throughout, and those opportunities for feedback and reflection. So that has all of those elements of experiential learning that we've talked about. So this is where we've landed in terms of our definition, and you do have that with those kind of components defined on the handout that you have, and you'll have a chance to kind of dive in and engage in that as we go. We wanted to, before we move on, also talk a little bit about why experiential learning matters. So taking that definition and thinking about why we are investing the time and resource. And again, don't want to belabor this because I know this group is very committed already. The fact that you've given up some of your time to be here shows that. But I think it's helpful to just frame it as we're talking to colleagues and as we're thinking about why we're investing our own time and energy in this, to think about why we are doing so. Ultimately, experiential learning helps us support students to achieve the types of goals that we have set out for them. The capacity to use the knowledge that they've gained in ways that matter during their study, but also after graduation. That's really fundamentally what experiential learning helps us to get to. So they can think critically, they can help solve problems. Without that, we can have a gap between what students know and what we want them to be able to do. We can end up with a gap in between those two things. So let's start by just considering what our ideal circumstance is in terms of a setup of a learning experience. If my clicker works, there we go. I'm just waiting for it to go like 3 times. So we start with an outcome. So what we want the student to learn to do during the course, that thing that we've defined that this learning experience will help them do. On the other side of that, we've got the assessment, the evidence that will accept that they've actually achieved that outcome. Okay, so this is kind of a nicely kind of lined up learning opportunity. And fundamentally, in a perfect learning experience, the instruction, what we do to help facilitate students in learning, is what will bridge that gap between that outcome and them producing that evidence that they've achieved the outcome. So that's what helps us get from the outcome to that assessment. And ideally, again, those learning experiences, if we want to get them to being able to do something, include students being able to actually practice, to get feedback, to reflect on their experience, and that helps them move across that bridge towards being able to produce that evidence. And that's called constructive alignment. Again, I know this is a concept known by some in the room, might be new to others. So what happens when we don't have that? So we're gonna just dive into a little bit more of a specific example. So if we have an outcome set for somebody where we actually want them to design a working prototype that is responding to a particular problem that's been set for a group of students. And our assessment is that we want them to share that prototype with a panel of experts. So we've got outcomes and assessment set up here that are really quite well aligned with what we might expect in experiential learning. But inadvertently, we just tell students about the design process. We give them definitions of the parts of the design process, rather than having them actually do that application, get that feedback, and reflect on it, and kind of make their way across. So we've got a gap here between what we've done in the instruction and where we want to get them to. And this is the knowing-doing gap. This is coming directly from Dr. James. The knowing-doing gap, where we're not going to get students across that bridge. We're not going to get them to achievement of outcomes because our instruction hasn't given them that bridge, hasn't allowed them to get to that point. So it's less likely in this example that most students will learn what we intend them to learn. Some will, because they'll find a way to do it themselves, but we haven't intentionally designed our learning experience for that to happen. So that's really an important component of experiential learning. It helps us build that bridge. It helps us have students achieve those outcomes that we intend them to. They can learn how to apply their knowledge in real situations, in those contexts that we've got that are set up as authentic. And it allows students to actually tackle those real authentic problems with real organizations sometimes. And it also can help students see the purpose in their course. If they can see that the outcome is something that they are going to be able to use after graduation, it helps them also see relevance and connect to their learning experience. And ultimately, we've set in our university plan a goal, an ambition, to have distinguished learners who can address the greatest challenges and opportunities. Our graduates can address the greatest challenges and opportunities the world faces, and that certainly requires application of knowledge in complex ways. But I did want to talk just a bit about kind of a matrix that we've created to help to present the different types of experiential learning that happen on our campus, help us imagine what experiential learning could look like, and help us kind of open up those opportunities for different types of experiential learning. We wanted to recognize that experiential learning can happen in different locations, and we kind of alluded a little bit to this at the beginning. So there are different locations where experiential learning can occur. As long as the experience that's created, that's intentionally designed, meets that definition, experiential learning can in fact occur within the classroom. It can occur within a lab, within a performance space. It can also occur, of course, in a professional context or some other type of immersive context that's not on our campuses. And all three of those are perfectly valid locations for experiential learning to occur. We recognize that as we move from kind of classroom-based experiential learning opportunities to that more immersive context that's kind of outside of the academic environment, the complexity of those opportunities, that context grows. And the richness and the depth of learning that students can get by having to navigate that complexity certainly is there. They can learn from all facets of that more immersive experience. So we want to acknowledge that it can happen in all three of these areas. We want to acknowledge that experiential learning can be done in the classroom. It can be more accessible to a larger group of students if we actually design intentional experiential learning in the classroom. But we want that to grow. We don't want that to take the place of those more immersive experiences that can happen outside of our campus environments. We also acknowledge that there are different types of experiential learning that occur in our context. And we've got some icons to represent these. So work or entrepreneurship focused, research focused, project or problem focused, community service or engagement focused, and then creative practice focused. So if we take those domains and we lay them on one side, and then we map that with those three different contexts, in which experiential learning can occur, those locations in which experiential learning can occur, we create a matrix. And that means we can fill that matrix. You might be able to see this better on looking on the sides. with different types of experiential learning that can happen, different contexts across those varying domains. And that gives us kind of an opportunity to think quite broadly about the different types of experiential learning and the different ways in which we can create those intentional learning experiences for students. Again, in the classroom, a little bit more accessible to a larger group of students, and then moving to that more immersive kind of context out in a professional or other type of context. And also, in addition to this, in alignment with our intention to have students be able to engage in an intercultural society, to be able to work on advancing inclusivity both in their learning but also after graduation, we have added some intentional amplifiers. And these amplifiers are intercultural or international in focus, as well as Indigenous focused or Indigenous led. These really can add a further richness and complexity to the domains that exist, the 5 domains that exist. So a student, for example, could work with an Indigenous community partner on a community engaged project. And that could add that complexity and richness to that experience for that student. We could also see a student undertake a project with an intercultural lens, for example, in the problem or project focused strand. So again, adding that kind of complexity and richness. This does definitely require intentional planning, careful planning, so that we are in fact supporting students in having those intercultural and kind of inclusivity focused activities as part of their experiential learning.